Welcome to News from Neptune for the 38th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a socialist government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Historians consider a generation to be about 25 years, roughly the time it takes you to get to the age your parents are now. For more than a generation, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of the program are available at archive.org. I'm now the age my parents would have been when we started the program, and my eldest son is the age I was then. It has not been an encouraging 25 years. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for 3 generations. He wrote his first political article at the age of 10 on the fall of Barcelona to Franco's troops in the fraught year of 1939. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things in a Bridging the Gap, No Trump Bids edition of News from Neptune, with thanks to Dr. No J.B. Nicholson for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. There's an interesting interview with Chomsky, of which I'll also point, I'll post a link to it on the Facebook page as well, in which the interviewer, Matt Taibbi, says, quote, "There's a whole literature of reporters running to Chomsky in search of scare quotes about how this time things are really bad, and coming away disappointed when Chomsky answers with a shrug that, no, things have always been this crazy. Just remember X and Y and Z," and he gives examples. That drives reporters nuts, particularly in the Trump era, where there's constant pressure in the media business to scrape up a 10-alarm quote about how whatever lunatic thing Trump did today is the worst thing ever. Chomsky has been a constant disappointment to the popular press. He keeps telling reporters that Trump's daily insanities are a distraction, and the real problems involve his administration's dismantling of regulatory systems, its failure to focus on global warming, and its worsening of the threat of nuclear war. These are all things that, while historically awful, mostly happen behind closed doors, away from the headlines. Chomsky has said, years ago, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow a very lively debate within that spectrum. That's the source of Russiagate now, for example, and the so-called Trump derangement syndrome, which is quite real, I think. Should we have a lively debate about Trump, David?
Actually, I do have that planned. But
okay.
It's not really about Trump. It's more like New York Times journalists covering Trump. But,
okay.
Yeah.
A belated Shana Tova, by the way.
Well, thank you.
What's on your list for the new year?
Well, let's get right into it then.
Yeah.
If you want.
Sure.
There's 2 journalists at the New York Times, 2 opinion-based columnists at the New York Times, who kind of try to put a sort of social science, intellectual kind of discursive gloss on what's going on.
Like we do.
Yeah, like we do, but they're not. But their problem is they're kind of dumb.
They're better and better paid.
And better paid. Yeah. So if we're so smart, why I'm so smart? Why aren't I rich?
Exactly.
But one of them is Thomas Edsall. We'll leave him aside for a minute. Let's talk about Dave Leonhardt. That's spelled Leonhardt. But I think it's pronounced Leonhardt. And he wrote a column a couple of days ago, Trump derangement syndrome is a myth. Now, how does he define Trump derangement syndrome? Did you happen to read this column?
I didn't see this one, no.
And so he defines it not in terms of New York Times columnists or New York Times journalists like what's splashed over the front page of the New York Times this morning Scott Shane et al. With this elaborate article about Russiagate. Really, supposedly, I think their idea is that here we've really got the goods.
Yep.
Here we're really gonna, we're going all out here, so that nobody can possibly argue with the fact that the Russians had a conspiracy to elect Donald Trump president. That they were effective in that conspiracy. That Donald Trump presumably is president for reasons having to do with that. We're not supposed to question any of that. There's a long article which I did not read except for a few sentences. I don't know if it's worth the time to do that. I'm waiting to see what the response might be from those who have tried to debunk this notion, most notably Aaron Mate on the Real News, which I'm sure will happen within the next week or so, if he gets an interview with anyone. But what Dave Leonard is saying, Trump derangement syndrome doesn't have anything to do with Russiagate so much as it has to do with the fact that the Democratic Party is presumably reacting to Trump by moving farther to the left, which of course to New York Times journalists shouldn't be done. We have to be very careful how far to the left we might move, and what Leonard assures us, quote, is that the Democratic Party has not actually become a band of radical leftists, setting up the straw man that people are claiming that they've become a band of radical leftists, and that's what Trump derangement syndrome is primarily, not the Russiagate thing. And he goes on, quote, for starters, look at this year's primaries, which finished last week. Across the country, a grand total of 2 Democratic incumbents in the House lost a primary. 0 Senate candidates did. In conservative states with moderate Democratic senators, notice the word conservative states, moderate Democratic senators, like we know what those things mean, like Indiana, North Dakota, and West Virginia, not one of those moderates even faced a serious primary challenge. Surprise, surprise. That's my words. Again, quoting David Leonard, it's true that a few proudly left-leaning Democrats won gubernatorial primaries, like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Andrew Gillum in Florida. But I encourage you to watch a few of their speeches. For one thing, both are strong candidates. For another, as if, it's not possible for a leftist candidate to be a strong candidate. For another, they are hardly socialists. Perish the thought that they could be socialists. And the list of progressive insurgents who got thumped is much longer. In New York, Cynthia Nixon didn't crack 35%. That's in her race in the primary against Governor Andrew Cuomo within the Democratic Party. So Leonard continues, meanwhile in Congress, the party's reaction to President Trump tells a similar story. Political pundits sometimes talk about Trump derangement syndrome, a condition supposedly in which his presidency has made Democrats go crazy, except that it hasn't. In other words, he's defining it in terms of Democrats going crazy by going left. He's completely misconstrued the whole idea of what Trump derangement syndrome, and all he has to do is read the front page of his paper every day to find out what that is. To take one example, he proceeds, there is strong evidence that Trump has broken the law both by obstructing justice and by using the presidency to enrich himself. Still, Democratic leaders refuse to push for impeachment. They say the country should wait for Robert Mueller's investigation to finish. I think that's wise, says David Leonard. Either way, it's certainly not deranged. So that's his way of completely obscuring what it is they're talking about when in one fell swoop, obscuring what it is they're talking about with Trump derangement syndrome and what is actually going on in the Democratic Party, which of course is overrated in many ways. We can talk about that, but that the success of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez isn't Trump derangement syndrome. It's people trying to change the Democratic Party, regardless of Donald Trump.
And the notion that the Democratic Party has moved to the left I mean,
Yeah.
in any sense at all, since the presidential campaign, which apparently what's being argued here, is outrageous. First of all, the notion of right and left in American politics is so corrupted right now, and has been for a good long time, that it's very difficult to say quite what you mean by that, or it's necessary to say what you mean when you say the Democratic Party has moved to the left. What can you possibly mean about a party which is attacking a Republican president on the grounds that he's too friendly with Russia, on the grounds that he's not pushing for war with Russia and China, that as the last administration, which by the way was a Democratic administration, did do. People are not aware of how much the Obama administration engaged in what used to be called brinkmanship, but war provocations against Russia in Eastern Europe, Ukraine being the best example, and in East Asia, where the South China Sea was the scene of American provocations against Russia in its home waters, so to speak. And note who was Secretary of State while this was going on, Mrs. Clinton herself. And the administration, the Obama-Clinton administration, heightened the war provocations against Russia and China in a way that's actually quite traditional in American foreign policy. For more than a century, the American foreign policy has been based on making sure that no one, domestic or foreign, organizes Eurasia in a sense that U.S. can't exploit it. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about. The Japanese were creating a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere that meant to control the economic development of East Asia, the economic integration of East Asia, and freeze out the Americans who, ever since 1899 in the open door policy, have insisted that East Asia was our oyster to harvest. Now, look. What's going on in the Democratic Party in the last couple of years has been a continuation of the American policy of exploitation of Eurasia, and Donald Trump comes along and says, we're going to change that. I'm going to do a deal with Putin. I'm going to do a deal with China's President Xi. We'll work out deals that will be good for all of us. And the American economic system, with the neocon politicians at their head, goes absolutely nuts. How dare this interloper talk against the system that we've run for years and has produced wars in our lifetime as vicious as the war in Korea and the war in Vietnam. This man is a traitor. They've used that language specifically about Trump's talking in the campaign about making peace with Russia and China. When he got into office, the pressures are such that he's gotten with the program. The actual American foreign policy hasn't changed that much under Trump, but then he does do things like meet with the leader of North Korea in Singapore, and defense stocks plummet because there's the very real danger that peace may break out in the Trump administration. So what you possibly could mean, and I haven't mentioned Russiagate yet, what you can possibly mean about the Democratic Party moving left since the last presidential election, I can't feature. It depends upon an absolutely blinkered regard for American political mythologies.
At the top of Jeffrey St. Clair's column this morning on Counterpunch is the following brief paragraph. The transformation of the Democrats into the party of the neocons is now complete. The Senate just passed a $674 billion military budget. That's up from 600 or so what it was previously, and that's half of the discretionary spending, now more than half of the federal discretionary spending, excluding Social Security and health care and that kind of thing. The largest since the peak of the Iraq War, and a $17 billion increase from last year. Well, he says $17 billion. I think it's actually more than that. There were only 7 no votes, none of them Democrats. The 7 no votes were Rand Paul, Pat Toomey, Ben Sasse, Mike Lee, Jeff Flake, David Perdue, and Bernie Sanders, given that Bernie Sanders is not formally defined as a Democrat. So there you go.
Yeah, and it seems to me that we should pay attention to what's actually going on in the Congress and the attempts of the Democrats to seize control of the Congress in the November election. The Democrats have put together across the country a collection of Democratic candidates for Congress that is heavily stacked with spooks, ex-CIA guys and girls, as the new head of the CIA, leads the way. The attempt by the Democrats to find candidates who support the American war policy, the neocon policy that was attacked by Trump during the campaign, has been quiet but effective across the country. There are a whole series of these new left Democrats, left my eye, who are in fact ex-military intelligence people, ex-CIA people, ex-NSA people, or not even ex in some cases, and they're doing fairly well across the country, as the Democrats do fairly well in these House races, look to do fairly well in these House races. The party, after a presidential election, the next congressional election normally returns a larger number of members of the opposite party for obvious reasons. They've got a president now who promised things, and those things are not happening, so they vote for the other party. It doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats who've won the presidential election. There is a turn towards the other party in the next congressional election. That will happen this winter. The question is, how much will it happen? What will be the case in terms of the Democrat control of the Congress? Will the Democrats get control of the House? They probably will. Will they get control of the Senate? They probably won't. But nevertheless, there are possibilities in both of these areas. And the candidates who are being elected are these pro-war apparatchik. It's quite remarkable that this sort of thing is happening, and it's happening under the radar.
Yeah. A kind of interesting, in a perverse way, column in the News Gazette this morning by the Washington Post columnist Mark Thiessen,
yes,
in which he celebrates, again, you kind of have to analyze this in several different ways in terms of what he's thinking and what he's saying and what
right.
Trump is actually doing and what it all means. But he's basically, as a neocon, Mark Thiessen, I think, was a George Bush speechwriter or something or other. As a neocon, Trump is making this fellow really happy.
Yep.
And the reason he's making us really happy is he's according to Mark Thiessen, he's fighting war after war after war. He's keeping the war party going, and he does. And even when he doesn't keep the war party going, supposedly North Korea, it's because he's been tough. It's because he wielded, he made some threats and he did this or that, and then Kim Jong-il came to the table or had a meeting or whatever. But everything is interpreted within the neoconservative framework in which Trump is presumably within. Well, we can debate about. Well, we can't really debate about what's going on in Trump's head, but when Trump, and if Trump reads this, if he were to read this, he would probably be somewhat flattered by it, and he would say, "Yeah, I am doing the right thing," and he'd sort of go back to do what he's doing. But there's different ways that the war, what Justin Raimondo calls the war party, is keeping Trump in line. And one way is not just by criticizing him, but by flattering him.
Yeah. And the war party notion is really worthwhile to rescue from the usage by columnists, for the most part, don't understand what Raimondo is talking about.
Yeah.
What Raimondo means is that there is a consensus in the American government, sometimes called the deep state, if you want. I don't like that very much. But permanent government, which was used a few years before for the same phenomenon, works better. The permanent government is a war party. It's made up of the leadership of both major political parties, as we say, the intelligence community, Words are amazing. The CIA, the NSA, the FBI, so forth, and the Pentagon, the military, or at least good bits of it, are all in favor of this sort of forward foreign policy, these war provocations against China and Russia, the war provocations that the U.S. has used, as I was saying, since the beginning of the last century, the ending of the one before, in order to maintain the economic dominance of the American 1%. It's also the case that the war party represents the present concerns of the American 1% in dominating the world economy and not allowing the rise of peer competitors, as the late Zbigniew Brzezinski said, in the world at large, but notably in Eurasia. That's what American foreign policy is doing, regardless of which party is in power. But the interesting thing is that the older tradition that saw the Democrats as the liberal party and the Republicans as the conservative party is in fact a very recent origin. The only real conservative notion of American foreign policy within living memory was that of the Republican Party in the 1950s. Robert Taft was probably the last spokesman for a foreign policy that is condemned as isolationist now, and that's the sort of talk we get from the people we're talking about today. Neoconservatism, which is often, I think, misunderstood by people who read the New York Times, and that's not an accident. Neoconservative refers to a foreign policy that wants to use the military force of the United States actively in order to continue this domination of the world economy that the U.S. inherited at the end of the Second World War. The neoconservative notion has nothing to do with the conservatism of Robert Taft and the non-involvement with the politics of the world at large that he was charged with. What we're talking about when we talk about neoconservatism is a militarily aggressive foreign policy that pushes for war, pushes for the threat of war and the actuality of war in the notorious cases of Korea and Vietnam, in order to maintain this American economic hegemony. In a situation like that, to talk of the Democratic Party as moving left is just silly.
Yeah. So just a footnote here, there's a fellow named Daniel Bessner, B-E-S-S-N-E-R, who is a professor at the University of Washington in Washington State. And he's been getting a lot of notoriety recently on the various leftist outlets, Jacobin and some of the podcasts I listen to, but also had a column in the New York Times recently, which I don't think was watered down in any way to make him look less sort of leftist than he is. He's a harsh critic of the foreign policy establishment, the war party, the deep state, and the academic work he's done that he's been talking about in these outlets to a certain extent has to do with the foundation in think tanks like the rise of the so-called defense intellectuals after World War II, of which Daniel Ellsberg, the notorious Daniel Ellsberg, was one at the RAND Corporation, but many others, many of these theorists and strategists of the Cold War and of the military, and where and how force should be used, force of various kinds, hard power, soft power, all this stuff. And he's been extremely good at unraveling, not just going, usually when people talk about the neoconservatives, they go back to Henry Jackson, at least maybe a little farther, but they see Henry Jackson as being the founding father. And in some way, he is. It all came together towards the end of the Vietnam War, with Henry Jackson deciding, this country is going crazy. People don't want war anymore. We need to get back into control here.
That's right.
And so, but before Henry Jackson, there were all these other people that really provided the intellectual intellectual foundations for the Cold War and beyond, which has continued into the whole era of the War on Terror and our moving from Southeast Asia to the Middle East with our primary conflicts. So I would recommend you could look up his article in the New York Times or his articles in Jacobin, or listen to the interviews that he's done both on the podcast, the Nostalgia Trap, and I think Dead Pundit Society. Maybe Doug Henwood. I'm sorry, getting confused, but there he is. He's the real deal in terms of understanding some of this stuff in a pretty academic context.
There's a lot of confusion going around. I mean, don't we shouldn't feel bad about adding to it when we can.
Yeah.
The invocation of Henry Jackson, the forgotten Democratic senator from Boeing, as he was called at the time, reminds me always of the fact that my wife, who has, how shall I put it, taken a somewhat skeptical view of my political views over the years, always likes to remind me that in 1972, I predicted that there was no doubt that Henry Jackson would be nominated for president, that this McGovern thing would go away and Henry Jackson would become the nominee.
Yeah.
Because he was what you described, the neoconservative candidate, and the candidacy of the peacenik wasn't going to defeat him. That seemed clear to me in 1972, but that's long ago and far away.
I actually think, I'm not sure about this, but I think Daniel Bessner, who's at University of Washington, Seattle, he may have actually gotten part of his work from studying Henry Jackson and then going from there. Since that's a big deal. Since Henry Jackson is a pretty big deal there. But moving forward, I think what you've got with Henry Jackson was this icon of supposedly defense strategic thinking. So he was respected. That's the way these senators who were in the Armed Services Committee, et cetera, et cetera. You had Henry Jackson, and then you had another Democrat, I think Sam Nunn from Georgia. And you've had various people who are always promoted as rising above the partisanship and keeping the ship of state on course. And I'm not sure who that is right now. They may be lacking in that. The person, I mean, Lindsey Graham, the late John McCain, of course, fancied himself that way, and that's what all the fuss was after he died, or even before he died. And now Lindsey Graham, I guess it's his turn, if the Republicans stay in power, to sort of assume that mantle of the great overseer of the military-industrial complex and all of the ideas that keep the war machine going.
While we're talking about these political positions, neoconservative and neoliberalism and so forth, in the dark backward abysm of time that 1972 represents for most of us, it's worthwhile remembering that the 72 election really was the goad for the rise of neoliberalism as well as neoconservatism. What happened in 72 is that the general disgust with the Vietnam War, and we have to remember that it was general, that by 1972, 3/4 or more of Americans thought that the war in Vietnam was not just a mistake, but it was a crime. And that was the sort of thing that the political establishment couldn't countenance, and therefore it had to destroy the candidacy of the one candidate who was saying things like that is George McGovern. But in the process, they had to take back the Democratic Party for war and economic domination and count on the Republican Party doing the same. The development of neoliberalism and neoconservatism grew out of the fear that this disaffection for the Vietnam War would produce major changes in American policies at home and abroad, and that had to be stopped. The best example of this thinking was a book that was published in the mid-'70s by the Trilateral Commission, written by several major political scientists in the U.S., Japan, major economic power at the time under American tutelage, and Europe. The book was called The Crisis of Democracy, and there were people who did think there was a crisis of democracy in 1970, in the early 70s. The crisis of democracy, in these people's minds, this is the people who spoke for the American 1%, the crisis of democracy was that there was too much democracy around, that Americans had got the idea that their disapproval of the Vietnam War should become policy, that we shouldn't carry on wars like that. For the American ruling class, that had to be scotched. We had to get away from that somehow. One way to do it was to run the Republican run the Democratic candidacy of George McGovern and destroy it, stamp it out, start a backfire, so to speak, that would put out this crisis of democracy, this crazy notion that Americans can decide that they don't want to go to war. We have to stop that. But there was a further problem in that the crisis of democracy, the citizen involvement that the Vietnam War had brought, was impinging on economic policy by the American government. Economic policy and war policy have been bound up together since Alexander Hamilton, since George Washington. They belong together, naturally enough, in a society economically and politically developed like ours. What happened was that the Democratic Party, supposedly, at the time, the left party, because of the appearance of the anti-war movement within the ranks of the party, the left party had to give up that economic notion that had been around since the time of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that the government was responsible for ameliorating the worst excesses of American capitalism, to take the harsh edge off American capitalism for American workers. Things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, things like this that grew out of the Depression. That had to be done away with in the early 70s. They had to turn away. The American government was being forced by the 1%, those who had profited so well out of the earlier years, to turn away from that. The suppression of the gentle, in one sense, class politics of the New Deal meant that American liberals had to find something else to be liberal about. And they looked around, and as a result of the civil rights movement and so forth, suddenly decided that they won't worry about exploitation, as the New Deal did. They'll worry about discrimination. And not, of course, just discrimination against black people. They'll look around for other groups that can be discriminated against, like women, for example, sexual minorities. The list expanded very rapidly. But it was important to understand that this identity politics, this expansion of the list of discriminated groups, was precisely designed and consciously designed as a counter to an attack on exploitation in the American economy. It was a way to rebuild the American economy in the interests of the American 1%. And by the way, 40 years later, we may notice it's been extremely successful. The identity politics of the Democratic Party was never more clearly in evidence than in the Clinton campaign. And the success of the Trump campaign is just as frightening to the American establishment as the threats posed by the McGovern campaign and the Democratic Party in the early 70s. So if we look at American political history, we know American political history in recent years, or it seems recent to me, the intertwining of war and the economy, war and the profits of the American 1% is especially evident, and it is bound up with the identity politics that we find so misleading in American political discussion today. This is a situation in which it's extremely difficult to say, oh, well, we have a left-wing political party and a right-wing political party, and you have to make your choice between them. That's not true. And it certainly isn't true in terms of the Democratic policy, the Democratic Party's activity in the current election cycle. I want to thank our colleague Karen Aram for sending us an important column by the WSWS, the World Socialist website, that gives details about how the Democrats are trying to run military figures and ex-spooks into the election cycle that we're in the midst of right now. And I've caused shock and horror among my liberal friends by suggesting that the danger of giving the Democrats control of the Congress means that in Illinois' 13th Congressional District, where we live, we really have to vote for the feckless Republican. I don't think you quite bought that, David, but it seems to me that given what the Democratic Party is doing, which you started out with today, and it seems to me that's exactly the right question, given what the Democratic Party is doing, there's no escape. There's no alternative. We can't let the Democrats run the House.
That's an interesting concept, and I will continue to mull it over.
Okay.
There's no Democratic candidate at any level that is causing me to want to run to the polls in a couple of months or a few weeks. And I've actually considered not even voting because I don't know if it matters at any level who's elected to what office.
Not that not that there's any good choice, but there are less bad choices, I think. Now the bad choice is to let the Democrats have control of the House.
Yeah, well, and then again, I haven't looked at this recently, but this district has never been very high on the list of people of districts that might flip from R to D.
It suddenly is. The Democrats have decided. Okay. Yeah, the Democrats have just added this on the grounds that our Republican incumbent is such a weak candidate.
Yeah. We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see what happens. Just another footnote to that. I mean, there's this lineage of foreign policy thinking, and one of course, in the post-World War II era, the primary person was George Kennan, the diplomat who wrote a lot and thought a lot about the Cold War. But when he did not avidly support the Vietnam War, nobody really wanted to hear it.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
It doesn't matter whether you're one of these people and then you change your mind. If you change your mind, then you're just not one of them anymore.
Well, that's...
I may be, there's a kind of a nuanced understanding of what he was saying, but he basically was opposed. His containment policy, which was the Cold War policy, didn't include the Vietnam War.
And he had the misfortune, if that's quite the word, of living too long. He died out over 100, and the account he had given, the very important account he had given at the end of the Second World War, he was director of policy planning for the State Department in 1949 and wrote a famous memorandum. Of course, it was top secret then, but later, it was 30 years later, it was revealed that he was talking about the extent to which the U.S. had to stay away from altruism and simply look for its own interests because of the disparity that existed between the 5% of Americans and the 95% of the rest of the world, in that the 5% of the Americans in 1949 owned half the world. Now, once again, that even within America, of course, that was not evenly divided, shall we say, and the imperialism of American foreign policy in the years since the Second World War was exactly involved in maintaining the disparity, as Kennan said, maintaining the economic control of the world that the U.S. had inherited as the only undamaged country after World War II. So Kennan, I think you're right about Kennan, and the examination of his career tells us a great deal about the real nature of American foreign policy against all the propaganda from the American political parties about what we were doing in terms of saving freedom for the rest of the world.
It's pretty shocking to hear. I think, if I'm recalling correctly, Barack Obama in his oration at John McCain's funeral, kind of praising Theodore Roosevelt, sort of lumping in the great Lincoln and Roosevelt and whatever. That shows a real lack of understanding about who Theodore Roosevelt was and what he stood for, and it's kind of shocking. I mean, he was beyond everything else, he was a horribly racist man.
Yes.
I just don't get it. I don't get how people can adore Obama after saying something like that.
Well,
but then again, no, whatever.
A very high level of mystification is necessary in order to carry on discussions like this. The Obama phenomenon, it brought to the fore someone who's very good at that obfuscation, and he continues it in his post-presidential career. Some hesitation may be occasioned by the recognition that amongst these pearls of wisdom from Barack Obama came also orders for the first American presidency of 2 terms to be at war throughout those 2 terms, and that the actual war policy of the American presidency in Obama's administration was particularly aggressive even in comparison with the previous administrations in regard to Russia and China. The need for real history, the need for an accurate account of what's just happened is, it seems to me, paramount. To give a real account of what the U.S. has been doing against the mystification of the greatest propaganda system that's ever existed in history, which is the American media and concomitant academia, I might add, to give a good account of recent American history, or even long-term American history, including Teddy Roosevelt, is very difficult, and we're not doing it. It's our job. You're watching News from Neptune, which was founded originally to try to tell the truth and shame the devil. I have a paragraph here that I was reminded of this week that suggests the problems we're dealing with may have particular contemporary forms which are occluded by this propaganda system, but the problems themselves are not really all that new. This paragraph is from 500 years ago, written originally in Latin. In the year 1516, Thomas More, who had been in the administration of the English government, we might say, he'd been Chancellor of England, published a little book, or he was to be Chancellor of England, published a little book called Utopia. Utopia was a made-up word which means no place or good place. And his notion was that a good political world was no place. Utopia, he wrote in 1516, which he wrote in 1516, included the following paragraph spoken by the principal figure in the book. When I consider any social system that prevails in the modern world, remember the modern world here is 1516, I can't, so help me God, see it as anything but a conspiracy of the rich to advance their own interests under the pretext of organizing society. They think up all sorts of tricks and dodges, first for keeping safe their ill-gotten gains, and then for exploiting the poor by buying their labor as cheaply as possible. Once the rich have decided that these tricks and dodges shall be officially recognized by society, which includes the poor as well as the rich, they acquire the force of law. Thus, an unscrupulous minority is led by its insatiable greed to monopolize what would have been enough to supply the needs of the whole population." Close quote. Now, this man had never read Marx. This man had never seen the developed capitalist economy of the 19th and 20th centuries. This man was writing in the early years of the 16th century. Yet what he is saying there, and that is indeed what the Latin says, what he's saying there is eminent sense, it seems to me. So Thomas More in Utopia. By the way, Utopia is very much worth reading even today. The rest of it.
I'm ashamed to admit not having read it. I would assume, from what I know about English history, that Was he responding specifically to the enclosure movement of that era, or was that already not really going at full steam?
The short answer is no. He wasn't responding specifically to that. The enclosures were underway, but were not. Yeah, that's right.
Drove English peasants off the land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the general phenomenon of the control of the economy by the rich that he's talking about was true in these early years of capitalist economy. 16th century doesn't really see a capitalist economy as such, but it does see a crisis of feudalism, which Marx himself thought was the birthplace of capitalism, and from the midst of that, he offers the reflections that I just read.
And did Thomas More have his head cut off?
He did, and
was it political or
yes, it was
more personal?
Yes, he was. It's complex and an interesting reflection, sort of like in a distorted mirror. You see something that's going on now, but in a way, everything is slightly changed, so it's difficult to work out the parallels. The actual dispute that led to Thomas More execution by his sovereign, Henry VIII, was a dispute over the relationships to the Pope. The English Reformation, as it's called, and the insistence by a king in this early post-feudal world that he was going to run the church, not some foreign clergy. And on that argument, More lost his head, some would say figuratively, but certainly, I'm afraid, literally.
So Martin Luther wrote his theses just a few years after More wrote his
The 95
Utopia.
Theses of Martin Luther, which are another complex problem, appeared the year after Utopia. Utopia was written in 1516, and Luther's Theses in 1517.
And were they related at all? Or were they...
Only in the sense that they are connected with the political thought of the period, with Renaissance political thought in various ways. It's there's actually been. You've got me off on this, so you have only yourself to blame. There's actually been a good book that's come out just recently by a former editor of the New York Review of Books, which itself is remarkable, that he produced a good book. But he produced a very good called, Fatal, the movie gets in the way, Fatal Encounter. Not Fatal Attraction, Fatal Encounter. Fatal Encounter. Published last year, or published the beginning of this year, and it's about the debate between the two major theological figures of the early 16th century, Martin Luther, whom you mentioned, and Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was the best-known scholar in Europe and a great friend of Thomas More's as the century began. Hey, there were fewer people around, you knew one another. And it's the argument that consumed the latter half of the life of both Luther and Erasmus is well rehearsed in this book, and the context, political, economic, and theological, is well set out. So, remarkably enough, a good thing from the New York Review. I recommend it.
Well, as long as we're doing our art section now.
Okay.
Let me just read you what there wasn't a transcript for Amy Goodman's interview of Michael Moore, the filmmaker. But
this is
let me
what is sublime to ridiculous?
Describe what Michael Moore is up to these days. This is the blurb that will be supplemented by the transcript probably by now. It says, in July 2016, and he's got this new movie out about Donald Trump called Fahrenheit 11/9, which of course reverses his previous Fahrenheit movie about 9/11. It says, in July 2016, Michael Moore wrote a column titled 5 Reasons Why Trump Will Win. In it, Moore wrote, quote, Donald J. Trump is going to win in November. This wretched, ignorant, dangerous part-time clown and full-time sociopath is going to be our next president, President Trump. Go ahead and say the words, because you'll be saying them for the next 4 years, President Trump. He went on, and then the blurb goes on. He went on to list 5 reasons. Moore went on to list 5 reasons why Trump would be elected. Trump's focus on Trump's focus on the Midwest. Second, the last stand of the angry white man. Third, the Hillary problem. That's the only really true aspect of this. Fourth, the depressed Sanders vote. That's a little bit true. And finally, what he called the Jesse Ventura effect, people voting for Trump simply to disrupt the system. And that's a little bit true also. We talked to Michael Moore about his predictions and how Democrats failed to take Trump more seriously. So as a partial antidote, I would recommend reading the more extensive review of the movie by Louis Proyect on today's Counterpunch website. I don't usually recommend Louis stuff, but he's got a lot of good stuff. And what he writes, just one paragraph here. In the hopes of alerting Americans to the fascist threat, Moore superimposes the words of Donald Trump over footage of Adolf Hitler at a mass rally. While I understand Moore's frantic efforts to warn the world that we are in danger of a Reichstag fire-type false flag, quote unquote, that can lead to Donald Trump assuming dictatorial powers, perhaps what is needed more is a dispassionate analysis of how the Nazi Party became powerful enough to be in a position to carry out a coup in 1932. And most of the rest of Proyect's review is a good summary of how Adolf Hitler actually did come to power, which I won't read at length, but I think you might look at this.
We'll put a link up for that too.
And so I thought, Carl, that would be a good way of getting a rise out of you to read what Donald Trump or what Michael Moore is saying about Donald Trump. And you only have 5 minutes.
Yeah. Oh, you're so clever, David. You're so clever. Set me up, and then call the game on account of rain, right?
Concision. We're all about concision. Okay.
Concision. Yeah,
right.
Our regular listeners know that.
Yeah.
Our regular listener, he knows that.
You're the relief pitcher coming in, not with just the bottom of the ninth, and
right.
with the bases loaded and 2 outs. You've got one batter to hit to.
That's about right.
To pitch to.
And if I were going to pitch anything at all here, what I would pitch is populism. That's the noise that's not being made in the nonsense of Michael Moore's recent comments, pointing out that Moore knew that or predicted that Trump would be elected is worthwhile. I'm not quite sure that he had a good way to express the reasons that Trump was elected, and there still is enough arguments about that. Identity politics argument, which says to good liberals, well, of course, it was racism that elected Trump. I don't think it was racism that elected Trump. I think it was economics. I think it was the result of neoliberal policies. We were talking about them a few minutes ago. 40 years of neoliberal policies that Barack Obama covered with sweet names, and that that coverage had worn off by the 2016 election. People didn't believe it anymore, and the willingness of Americans to vote from the position they were actually in, a position of declining lifestyles for the majority, lifestyles that were being confiscated by the advance of neoliberalism, and the willingness to listen to someone who wanted to talk about making America great again, and the understanding of making America great again was to give to a contemporary American majority the possibilities that they understood their parents to have. The election of Donald Trump was a generational phenomenon. I began tonight's program by talking about the tendency of historians to speak of generations as about 25-year periods. What the election of Donald Trump was, and I'm not saying what Donald Trump was, I'm saying what the election of Donald Trump was a revolt of the masses, the majority of Americans who knew there was something wrong with continuing to support the neoliberal policies that had been represented by previous administrations, Republican and Democrat. The election was an election against business as usual in the American political establishment, and the poster boy for objections to a business as usual was the unlikely figure of Donald Trump. That's what produced the Trump election, and the subsequent history has shown the extent to which Trump has been tamed to the regular usage of American politics, which is, of course, the conspiracy of the rich that Thomas More was talking about 500 years before.
Yeah, let me just tease you briefly here what Project talks about, and I don't really know that much about this history myself. He talks mostly in terms of Hitler's rise to power being facilitated by the political cluelessness or whatever of a fellow named Chancellor Hermann Muller, M-U-L-L-E-R.
What a coincidence.
What a coincidence. That's one thing. That's one thing. But then let me just tease you by reading one sentence that Lewis wrote here in summarizing this narrative and comparing it to the current day and Michael Moore's movie. Lewis Project asks, can we expect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to be more like Rosa Luxemburg, who we mentioned at the beginning of every program, as the DSA, the Democratic Socialists, would have you believe, or like Herman Mueller? The jury is still out.
There's a great deal in your teasing that can be responded to. Let me mention just one thing that I think we have a minute or two to do. There was an election in Massachusetts, a primary election in Massachusetts 2 weeks ago, in which a longtime member of the House, Mark Capuano, was defeated. Capuano is peculiar in that he was a reliable anti-war vote from eastern Massachusetts, a reliable anti-war vote in the House of Representatives. Although he had been congressman from this district for years, he had voted against the war. He'd even joined in the suit against Barack Obama about the illegality of the attack on Libya. He'd been, as I say, one of the few reliable anti-war votes in the House. The Democrats ran he was a Democrat. The Democrats ran a primary challenge to their own Democratic representative in the person of an identity politics candidate, a young black female against this older white man, not even as old as I am, but old white man, and the challenger won, to everyone's surprise. What's going on here is the Democrats are removing their anti-war figures from the Democratic congressional delegation. That's the reason the Democrats shouldn't be given control of the House. The challenger agreed with Capuano on almost every issue except war. That was the one that made the difference. So we have once again.
So is there a smoking gun that really proves that in terms of the Democratic Party?
What both candidates said about their positions, what their views were, and the challenger said, in all but so many words, I agree with Representative Capuano on everything except his views on war. She came very close to saying that.
And that resonated with the voters in eastern Massachusetts.
I'm not sure. I think it was an example of using identity politics to counter an anti-war figure. The war was not an issue in the debate. What was the issue was a young black woman running against an old white man. And I think, given particularly the makeup of the district, she was chosen with malice, you might say, by the Democratic organization that wanted to get rid of an anti-war vote. And it worked.
Can we still be friends if I, instead of voting for Rodney Davis, just don't vote for either of these people?
Well, I think it may not be so effective, you know. I think there's a very real chance that we may get a Democratic representative in this region in the person of Betsy, as all the signs say.
Yes.
You've been watching News from Neptune. I must note here on the upcoming Festival of Chuseok, The Korean festival begins Monday, lasts for several days. Autumn Eve Festival in Korea. I think it may even be bound up with the discussion between the presidents of North Korea and South Korea, which is once again raising serious problems for the neocons in the American government. Peace threatens to break out once again in Korea, and we can't have that. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 38th week of 2018, a Bridging the Gaps, No Trump Bids edition. My parents played bridge all the time. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where the local anti-war, anti-racism effort will have a table at tomorrow's Farmers Market.
I hope so.
Perhaps. If the rain stay away, come talk to us there.
It looks good. It looks good.
Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.